You're tuned in to Sinister Shadows, where forgotten broadcasts resurface, strange signals bleed through the static, and the stories don't always stay fiction. If you found this channel, it's not by accident. Something brought you here. So settle in, stay quiet, and listen closely. What you're about to hear might sound like a story, but some shadows speak the truth. It was nearing midnight when Dean Sutton dropped his bag behind the counter of WZRD, a tiny, forgotten radio station tucked away on the outskirts of town. The flickering lights cast long shadows on the worn wooden floors, but it wasn't the dark that unsettled him. It was the silence. The kind of silence only broken by the hum of the station's equipment and the occasional creak of the building settling. Dean had worked here for 3 years, a relic of a bygone era where community radio stations were more than just advertisements and static chatter. But the town had outgrown the place, and now only a few loyal night owls tuned in. He wasn't here for fame or fortune. Hell, most nights, he was the only one listening. As he adjusted the dial and queued up the station's usual midnight playlist, a sudden thought hit him. The basement. He'd never actually been down there. Not once in the 3 years he'd been working here. A rumor floated around that it was a storage area for old tapes and equipment, but no one really knew for sure. The floor above creaked loudly as if the building itself was trying to grab his attention. He hesitated. His hand hovered over the mic. It wasn't uncommon for station staff to leave things behind, but there was something about tonight that felt different. There was a certain tension in the air, an electricity that Dean couldn't shake. He felt drawn to the basement. It took only a moment of indecision before he grabbed his flashlight and made his way toward the narrow stairs leading down into the dark. The basement was cooler than he expected, the air musty with the scent of old paper and forgotten memories. The light from his flashlight flickered as it cut through the dark, revealing stacks of old radio equipment, shelves piled high with tapes, and crates filled with mystery. He carefully navigated between the boxes, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him. That's when he saw it. At the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of old magazines, sat an unmarked tape recorder. Its worn buttons and rusting edges seemed out of place, as though it had been waiting here for decades, gathering dust in secret. Dean crouched down, wiping the dust off the top. He could just make out the words, "The last broadcast," etched in faded letters on the side. His heart skipped a beat. That name, it sounded familiar. He'd heard whispers about a show that had aired years ago, something about a midnight broadcast that never quite made sense. No one had ever talked about it openly, but Dean had heard enough to know it wasn't just some urban legend. The machine was still plugged in. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. The air felt thicker down here, the silence heavier. But curiosity won out, and Dean pressed play. The crackling of static filled the basement. Then, a voice. "Tonight, we speak to those who cannot speak for themselves," the voice said, a low, gravelly tone that made the hair on the back of Dean's neck stand up. "The rules are simple. Follow the instructions, and you will be free. Ignore them, and you will join us." Dean's pulse quickened. He was about to stop the tape, but something held him in place. It wasn't just fear. It was as if the tape was pulling him in, forcing him to listen. He leaned closer, the faint whisper of the static swirling around his thoughts. The voice continued. "Rule 1. You must play this tape on air at exactly midnight. If you do not, the consequences will follow. The dead cannot rest until their words are heard. The clock is ticking, Dean Sutton." His throat tightened. His name. How could the tape know his name? How could anyone know he was down there? He fumbled with the recorder, trying to stop it, but it wouldn't stop. The voice had already faded into a low hum, replaced by distant sounds, muffled voices, a knocking on wood, footsteps echoing from somewhere far away. Then suddenly the sound cut out, leaving nothing but a low hiss of static. Dean stood frozen, staring at the recorder in disbelief. He was breathing too fast, too shallow, like he couldn't catch his breath. What the hell was this? Why had he listened? And who or what had just spoken to him? The basement door creaked open. Dean's heart leaped into his throat as he spun around. There, in the doorway, stood a shadow, a tall figure shrouded in darkness. Dean's heartbeat pounded in his ears, the sound deafening in the suffocating silence of the basement. The shadow in the doorway remained still, almost as if waiting for him to make the next move. Dean took a step backward, his hand still clutching the flashlight, its beam flickering in a desperate dance as if even it was unsure of what it was illuminating. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, the question more of a plea than a command. His throat felt dry, the words slipping out like they didn't belong to him. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward just a little, the movement slow and deliberate. The air grew colder, and Dean felt a chill crawl up his spine, one that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. It was as if something unseen had wrapped itself around him, its grip tightening with every passing second. "Hello?" Dean repeated, his voice more forceful now, trying to steady his shaking hands. The flashlight beam bounced erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and move of their own accord. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, cloaked in darkness. Without warning, a loud crash echoed from somewhere above. A chair scraping across the floor, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Dean's eyes snapped toward the staircase leading up to the station's main floor. That wasn't possible. He had locked the door before coming down here. No one else was supposed to be in the building. Panic surged through him. The figure in the doorway didn't move, but something about it felt wrong. The air around it seemed to pulse, as though the very presence of this shadow was warping reality. Dean's breath quickened. He knew deep down that whatever this was, it wasn't human. He turned his attention back to the recorder, and then, for the first time, he noticed something else. Something that made his stomach twist with dread. The tape player had stopped. The screen was frozen on a single frame, a still image of static that seemed to twitch and shift as though it were alive. The words on the screen changed, becoming clear as day. "The rules are in place. The dead must be heard." Dean didn't have time to question it. He grabbed the recorder, shoved it into his bag, and bolted for the stairs, his heart thumping in his chest like a drumbeat. Upstairs, the radio station's main room was just as empty as he'd left it. The dim glow of the equipment seemed almost comforting compared to the suffocating darkness of the basement. But that comfort was fleeting. The front door was wide open. "Hello?" Dean called, his voice quivering with fear. No response. A shiver ran down his spine as he scanned the room. The station felt wrong, like it was no longer a place of work, but something else. Something that was now aware of him. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Something in the back of the room shifted. It was subtle, but Dean could hear it. A faint rustling sound. He moved cautiously toward the corner where the old vinyl collection was stored. The records, once organized neatly by genre, were now scattered across the floor, as though someone, or something, had been rummaging through them. He knelt down to pick one up. It was a record from a long-forgotten jazz artist cracked down the center. But it wasn't the record that caught his attention. It was the note, hastily scribbled in dark ink on a torn piece of paper beneath the vinyl. "Play the tape. Don't break the rules." Dean's hands trembled as he read it. His mind raced. How could this person have known about the tape? Who was leaving these warnings? And why? Suddenly the lights flickered once again, this time plunging the room into darkness. Dean's breath hitched. The silence was deafening, and the only thing he could hear now was the sound of his own heartbeat, thumping loudly in his chest. Then, from somewhere behind him, came a voice. A whisper. "Don't break the rules, Dean. You're not alone anymore." He spun around, but no one was there. Dean stood frozen, his mind a jumble of questions and fear. His eyes darted across the room, but there was no sign of anyone. The silence pressed in around him, suffocating. The only sound was the faint hum of the station's equipment, buzzing like a warning. The note was still clutched tightly in his hand, its cryptic message burning into his thoughts. Play the tape, don't break the rules. His breath came in shallow gasps, his pulse hammered in his ears. The tape, whatever it was, whoever it was, seemed to be pulling him deeper into its web, but he couldn't understand why. It was just a damn tape, right? Just a piece of something old, forgotten. But it felt more than that. It was more than that. Dean didn't know how much longer he could stay in the dark, both figuratively and literally. He had to follow the rules. But how? He had already started breaking them by taking the tape out of the basement. And now, the station felt alive, like it was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He reached for the phone, his hand still trembling as he dialed the number for the station's emergency line. He didn't know who to call, but he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. The phone rang once, twice, and then there was a click. Someone picked up. "This is WZRD radio. You're on the air. What's your emergency?" Dean's voice barely formed the words. I'm at the station. Something's happening. I found a tape. I don't know what's going on, but it feels like..." He didn't get to finish the sentence. The voice on the other end of the line cut in, interrupting him. "Don't break the rules, Dean. Play the tape. Or else..." The line went dead. Dean yanked the receiver from his ear, his hands slick with sweat. He stared at the phone, his heart in his throat. The voice. It was the same voice from the tape. That low, gravelly tone that had sent chills down his spine. He had to play it. But there was one more rule. Dean's fingers trembled as he loaded the tape into the recorder again. The machine seemed to hum in anticipation, as if it had been waiting for him to make this choice. The air around him felt heavier, charged with something sinister. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its hands creeping closer to the witching hour. Dean glanced at the window, the city lights barely visible through the dirty panes. Everything outside seemed calm, quiet. But the station? It was a different story. The machine whirred to life, and the familiar crackling of static filled the room. Then, once again, the voice spoke. "The dead must be heard, Dean Sutton. You have 2 minutes before the consequences are set in motion. Play the tape. Let the world hear." The words were like a command, and Dean had no choice but to comply. With a reluctant sigh, he flicked the switch and spoke into the mic. "This is Dean Sutton, and you're listening to WZRD. We have something special tonight. Stay tuned." He hesitated before pressing the button to play the tape. It started softly at first, almost like it was nothing more than an old recording, the kind you'd hear on a forgotten radio show. But then it changed. The voice grew clearer, sharper, and with each passing second the static seemed to pulse with an unnatural force. "You will hear us now." Dean's skin prickled. The voice was almost too loud now, as if it were coming from inside his own head. Suddenly the lights flickered again, and the room grew colder. A deep, low rumble vibrated through the walls, as though something ancient were stirring beneath the foundation of the building. The tape hissed and popped, the sound of distorted whispers filling the room. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and grow longer, as if they were reaching out to him. Then something else happened. The phone rang. Dean turned, his stomach sinking. He didn't want to pick it up. He knew who it would be. With shaking hands, he answered. "Hello?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end was different now. It was no longer just a whisper, but something more. A chorus of voices, all speaking. At once, their words overlapping, blending into a maddening cacophony. "You broke the rules, Dean. Now you will hear us. You will hear every last one of us." Dean slammed the phone down, his heart hammering in his chest. The voices, still echoed in his mind, their words like claws scraping against his sanity. He stumbled back from the desk, his legs trembling beneath him. The room was no longer just a room, it was a tomb, suffocating and alive, its walls pressing in on him as if they were closing in, inch by inch. He glanced at the clock. The hands were ticking down, almost mocking him with their slow, deliberate movement. 1 minute left. The tape continued to hiss and crackle in the background, its eerie whispers growing louder. The air was thick with something else now. Something oppressive, like a weight that pressed down on his shoulders and squeezed the breath from his lungs. He turned to the window, the view outside now warped, distorted by the unnatural flicker of the station's lights. The city lights looked far away, too distant, like he was no longer a part of it. The whispers grew louder, and then from somewhere deep within the static, one voice rose above the others. Clearer, sharper, as if it were standing right beside him. "We are the forgotten. We are the ones who never left. Play the tape, and you will know our names." Dean's breath hitched. His pulse raced as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned back to the tape recorder, unable to look away. The voices were all around him now, louder than ever, twisting through the air like tendrils of darkness. He reached for the button, his finger hovering above it, but something stopped him. A sudden realization clawed at the back of his mind. What would happen if he played it again? What if this was the point of no return? The whispers turned into a laugh, a cold, hollow laugh. "You have no choice, Dean. You must listen. You must let us speak." His fingers trembled, but his mind was made up. With a deep breath, he slammed the button down, and the tape began to play once more. This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice wasn't just coming from the tape, it was in the room with him, surrounding him, in his head. The whispers were no longer just whispers, but full voices, full of pain, full of rage. Names, endless disjointed names, each one clinging to the next. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. The equipment flickered, and for a brief moment Dean was plunged into a world of total blackness. He could still hear the voices. The tape was still playing, though he couldn't see it. "You broke the rules, Dean. Now you will hear us all." A light blinked on the control panel, casting an eerie green glow over the room. But it wasn't just the light that caught his attention. It was the figure in the doorway. A shadow stood there, tall and imposing, its form barely visible in the dim light. The air grew even colder, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from somewhere beyond the door. The figure stepped forward slowly, as if savoring each moment. Dean froze, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened as the figure came into focus. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets, his skin pale and decaying. His mouth was twisted into a grin that was more animalistic than human. And in his hands, a pair of headphones, long abandoned. Dean opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved toward him, slow and deliberate. And then, the voice, the same voice from the tape, filled the room once more. "You didn't follow the rules, Dean. Now, you'll never escape." The figure stepped into the light, and for the first time, Dean saw the true horror of what was before him. It wasn't just one dead soul. It was hundreds, thousands, each one twisted, deformed, and locked in this endless cycle, trapped in the tape, trapped in the station. All of them staring at him with hollow eyes. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of the dead. Their voices, their names, their pain, they were all around him, drowning him. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the clock struck midnight. The voices stopped. The room fell silent. For the briefest moment, everything went still. Dean dared to breathe. But as he did, the voices returned. Louder, angrier, and this time, they weren't asking him to play the tape. They were demanding it. "It's too late, Dean. You've broken the rules. Now you're ours." The station's walls seemed to pulse with the voices now, each one louder, more desperate than the last. Dean stood frozen, his entire body trembling as the shadows of the dead pressed in around him, closing in from every angle. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, his mouth dry. The room was spinning, warping, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing at the seams. "You're ours now, Dean." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room like an overwhelming storm, drowning out his thoughts. The whispers of the dead blended together in a maddening cacophony, an endless tide of grief, rage, and pain. He could feel their presence crawling beneath his skin, their cold fingers brushing against his mind. Dean fought the urge to scream. He tried to move, to escape, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the air itself had turned into quicksand, holding him in place. The figure, if it could still be called a figure, moved closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its lips stretching into a grotesque grin. The dead were all around him now, their faces twisted in eternal torment. The whole room seemed to be filled with their specters, their pain, their fury. He closed his eyes, trying to shut them out, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. "Play the tape. You must listen." The words echoed in his mind. Play the tape? His hand reached for the recorder, his fingers numb, as though moving through water. But just as his hand made contact, the entire building shook violently. The lights flickered, dimmed, then burst into a blinding white. Dean staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps as he looked around in panic. The station was changing, warping, twisting in on itself, as if the building was alive, responding to the chaos unfolding inside. The walls cracked and groaned, the floor buckled beneath him, and the very air smelled like decay. The clock on the wall ticked again, its hands frozen at midnight. The tape was still playing, the voices still calling to him. But now something was different. Something was wrong. The voice, the one that had been speaking to him, no longer sounded like a command. It sounded desperate. You must listen, or we will never leave." Dean's mind raced. His eyes darted between the recorder and the room around him. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this continue. But the tape, the voices, were pulling him in again, forcing him to listen, forcing him to follow the rules. The same rules that had led him to this moment. Play the tape. He reached for the recorder one last time, his fingers trembling as he pressed the button to stop the playback. The moment the tape ceased, the room went silent. The eerie hum of the static faded, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift. For the briefest moment, everything seemed normal. But that feeling didn't last long. The floor shook again, but this time it wasn't the building. It was something beneath it, something much older, something darker. The whispers returned louder than before, and now Dean understood. The voices were never meant to leave. "The tape is a door," the voice said, echoing through his mind. "You played it. You broke the rules. Now, you're the keeper." The walls cracked open, revealing the true horror of what lay beyond, an endless abyss, stretching out forever, filled with the souls of the dead who had never found rest. They were calling to him, pulling him into their world, their prison. Dean staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The room closed in on him, the shadows swallowing him whole. Then, in one final desperate move, Dean grabbed the tape recorder and threw it against the wall. The glass shattered, the machine sparking and crackling as the voices grew silent. The room stopped shaking, the oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders. The darkness receded, leaving behind only the faint hum of the station's equipment. But it was too late. The voices were gone, but so was the station. As Dean turned to the window, he saw the world outside. It was no longer the town he knew. The streets were empty, the buildings abandoned, the lights dim and flickering. The clock had stopped at midnight, and the city was trapped in the same moment, locked in an endless loop of time. He had played the tape. He had broken the rules. And now, the station would never leave. Neither would he. The last broadcast had come, and Dean Sutton had become its final prisoner.